Gregg Araki is one of my favorite directors of all time, and for anyone following my channel who isn't aware of who he is or why I would cover him for my next director retrospective, after doing a video on David Lynch and not choosing to follow up with a more well-known director like Steven Spielberg or Martin Scorsese, Araki was key to one of the most overlooked film movements of all time, the New Queer Cinema movement. Coined by B. Ruby Rich in 1992 in Sight and Sound magazine, it was recognized that when looking at the film festival circuit of the most recent year, Derek Jarman's Edward II, Christopher Munch's The Hour and Times, Tom Kalin's Swoon, Gregg Araki's The Living End, and Laurie Lynn's RSVP, all queer films that all released within a short period of time in either New York City or at the New Directors New Film Festival at Tribeca, and were quickly receiving attention. And this isn't to ignore the works of the queer directors that came before, because they're so important to making queer film what it was. Being a Baltimorean, I always have to share my love for John Waters and his ability to create the funniest moments through the most absurd situations and make films where the characters are often reflecting the queer panic that conservatives use to scapegoat the majority of society's issues. There are also filmmakers like Rainer Werner Fassbinder or Chantal Akerman, or even going back to Derek Jarman, who are all queer filmmakers that existed for decades, making films that highlighted queer life in a way that helped define the experience for many, but suddenly these films that existed within niche pockets of the queer community were gaining attention in the larger film community. This is splitting hairs, but some people define the new queer cinema movement starting in the late 80s, but some view it starting in the early 90s, and honestly I think the former is more true, with the airing of Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied being key to the beginning of this movement. Airing in 1989, the documentary highlighted black gay men in a way that really feels so groundbreaking for the time and refreshing, even still viewing it in a modern context, and right before its airing on PBS, or the US federally funded public broadcasting service for those outside the US. It was targeted by conservative groups who attempted to pull it from the TV channel because it had been partially funded by taxpayer money, and although several stations did pull it, it's likely that all the controversy drew more eyes in and made many recognize the need to highlight queer lives because its existence. And when looking at the film festival circuit and just at Sundance alone, queer films were starting to win major awards. In 1990, the seminal documentary about New York City ballroom culture, Paris is Burning, and in 1991, the three-part queer anthology split off into sections about an explicitly queer incarcerated couple, a story of patricide in the style of tabloid television, and another about a mysterious ailment that transforms a man into something much more frightening in the style of a B-movie, and Todd Haynes' Poison both won major awards, prompting Robert Redford, famous actor and one of the founders of Sundance, to state when questioned about the inclusion of a number of queer films at the festival, to just say these are simply the best films being made. And without a question, these films absolutely were the best films being made at the time. A large number of these films left an impression on me and so many others, and are just some of the best films ever made, pushing for not only better representation in film, but pushing the boundaries of what is expected with narrative structure, how these stories are told, which in turn is the queering of film as a whole. And this all leads to me to not only one of my favorite directors of all time, but also one of the most important directors of the new queer cinema movement, Gregg Araki. A director whose visions are so bold and punk, and to me feels like the child of John Waters in the way he approaches humor in his campy pictures through the use of slightly awkward but deeply expressive language that radiates angst and nihilism throughout all of his films, even in his much more lighter movies. His films peered into the soul of a queer community that never had a voice, and for as angry as his films were, there was always room for them to be horny, for a cast to be clad head to toe in clothes that defined 90s fashion, and for every image to be so expressive and vibrant and colorful. Color is so important to his films that there's even a brand new bonus feature on the Criterion Collection set of the three films that form the Teenage Apocalypse trilogy, or my favorite trilogy of all time, that center around his specific use of color. And through piracy, Gregg Araki's films have gotten a brand new life that have made his movies resonate with queer people in a way that has deeply concerned Gregg Araki to no end. His films also don't fit neatly into one box, each one so distinct in identity, one being a homage to 90s rom-coms, another an upsetting crime drama, and there's also a stoner comedy here, which might be the greatest film of its subgenre. I'm just going to pause the video here because I do want to make some more room for the man himself and his films, but if you do like what you're seeing, please consider liking, commenting with your favorite Gregg Araki film if you've seen them before, or subscribing and hitting that bell, or just consider following me in other places on the internet. That support elsewhere is always appreciated. So let's kick off the video by talking about actually Gregg Araki's first two films, because they share such similar DNA, and one of these films was actually lost for a very, very, very long time until it was uploaded randomly last year. Three Bewildered People in the Night, released in 1987, and The Long Weekend of Despair, which released in 1989, are Araki's two earliest films, and they also feel like ones that feel like a product of Gregg Araki being a recent college graduate, and feel like a playground for him to manipulate and bend his ideas into the genius of his theming that we see in his crisp work that was just around the corner. Both of these films are also black and white films that only cost $5,000 to produce, which for those that don't know is a microscopic budget, literally making a micro-budget film that are available in low-quality formatting because their sole preservation was on VHS videotapes that were just preserved just because someone realized that these could be important over time. While confirmed for his second feature after it was archived by NYU in 2024, sometimes in order for screening committees for film festivals to get access to movies before the age of sending screeners over various film portals, these films would be sent through physical VHS tapes. In the case of Araki's first film, enough of these survived for this first film to be readily uploaded online, but with The Long Weekend of Despair, the film only ever had one screening, making it extraordinarily elusive, with most people only ever seeing the film after the NYU archive upload last year, and anyone else from my knowledge supposedly getting in contact with Gregg Araki himself, and he would openly share those copies of people who just wanted to see the film. And three bewildered people in the night follows a love triangle between a video artist, a sweetheart, and her gay friend, and The Long Weekend of Despair follows three couples, a gay couple, a lesbian couple, and a heterosexual couple, all spending one weekend together. And while most of the scenes between these two films take place in environments readily available to film, the entirety of the film was produced through guerrilla filmmaking or filming in a location hoping for the best in terms of any third parties being there and hoping the cops don't get called on you. This is a filmmaking tactic often used by indie filmmakers to preserve budget and time just because the location can speak to you suddenly as you're just filming, and when you realize that you have a 14 or 19 or 21 day shoot, that can stop you dead in your tracks while you're waiting for paperwork to be approved or you have such a small budget in the first place to get any locations approved. It's probably been used the most in the mainstream when speaking about Sean Baker's films, with even his most recent films, Red Rocket and Nora, being made with guerrilla filmmaking despite his level of acclaim, recognition, or growing budgets. And Araki's two films here are at best watchable. Not bad by any means, and difficult for me to assess outside of the literal quality that they're preserved, because while that video looks grainy, I can get past that. The sound is god-awful here. But what fascinates me the most when watching his first two films are, one, how exactly didactic they are overall, with Araki conveying most of his ideas and thoughts about relationships through stray conversations in both films, with characters speaking in mostly overt, straightforward, but effective dialogue, still capturing a group of people that never got a voice in film. Watchable in every sense of the word, but mostly I'd recommend these to people who are trying to get a feel of Gregg Araki after seeing his other films, for those that want to examine Gregg Araki's films in a much more academic sense. And comparing these to Araki's other films, Totally Effed Up is probably the one that shares the most DNA with these films. Bringing us back to the film that thrust Gregg Araki into the heart of the new queer cinema movement and gaining attention for not just playing at Sundance, but also being nominated for the Grand Jury Prize, The Living End is easily described as a gay Thelma and Louise. Mostly unique in Gregg Araki's catalog, not in its weight because we still need to talk about Mysterious Skin, but there's a clear influence here from films of the French New Wave, specifically Godard, and I would have to guess that Terrence Malick's early work had some kind of influence here as well. Prime is central to most of the events of the film, following John, a young film critic with HIV who picks up Luke, another man with HIV, who has just had his lover stabbed to death by his own wife after capturing Luke in bed with him. There are equal moments of peace and terror for the two, as there are plenty of moments to revel in the embrace of two men feeling safety and comfort in each other's touch without fear of transmitting a diagnosis that felt like a life sentence for many at the time, and also contrasting that with these moments of real cathartic brutality when we see neo-Nazis mowed down in front of us at the second of any kind of threatened violence. But despite if we're talking about those Nazis or Luke's lover previously in the film, violence is never taken lightly here. It's clear watching Araki's films that he's been channeling an unspoken rage when confronting the HIV and AIDS epidemic, which was a crisis that, while anybody could be diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, primarily targeted gay men with its attention. And for many younger viewers who may have ignored this part of queer history, sadly caused many to lose their friends, family, and loved ones in such a collective form of loss that, sadly, in the context of 1992 being the release of The Living End, it also was the year where AIDS became the #1 cause of death for men between 25 and 44. And whether this anger is centered around anyone believing that they made a mistake in having unprotected sex, or having anger towards a government that was unable to address HIV or AIDS without creating stigma towards the queer community, or feeling to have an adequate response for so long until there was celebrity intervention, that anger was overwhelming and also created a depressive haze that makes anyone wonder, regardless of treatment options, what does my future look like? It's also not lost to me that when looking at this time in history, we'd lose many queer makers to AIDS as well, or AIDS-related illness, including the previously mentioned documentarian Marlon Riggs and also queer legend Derek Jarman, who would channel most of his thoughts about his final days into the highly experimental film Blue, a film comprised of one extended shot of a single shade of blue that was similar to the color of blue that Derek Jarman saw during his final days after losing his eyesight to AIDS-related illness. Gregg Araki is not afraid to linger on a moment which further makes The Living End contrast from his much more frenetically edited and chaotic appearing other films, and by sitting with these two characters, there's an overwhelming pain that's radiated that's impossible to ignore or not be able to recognize or empathize with when watching the film, even if you aren't able to immediately view the violence of the film being connected to this nihilism about the future. I think many can find themselves upset by how this violence is channeled in the finale of the film. It's honestly the only moment of the film that makes me pause when watching the film again, but to also see these two men embrace in such a bold way on the silver screen without filter also reflects on this multi-dimensional reflection of queer characters that we would see all throughout the new queer cinema movement. While The Living End would put all eyes on Gregg Araki, he would further solidify his voice as being one of the greats of the new queer cinema movement through making the Teenage Apocalypse trilogy, which boiled down many of the themes that we'd seen in Araki's previous work, with violence being key in a number of his films including The Living End, but these films were punchy, energetic, chaotic, deeply horny, and also existing in that rage and discontentment that came with being a young queer teenager at this time and being promised a future that was far brighter than that of your forefathers, but questioning if you could make it to the next day. And the three films of this trilogy exist in totally different spaces. Totally Effed Up, or Another Homo Movie by Gregg Araki, is a film broken into 15 parts, featuring 6 teens comprised of 4 gay men and 2 lesbians in an episodic format that feels very documentarian, either in capturing moments between characters that seem to be authentic to their everyday and therefore everyday queerness, but also interspliced with these talking head segments where characters are able to be interviewed by the camera, giving their inner thoughts as directly as they possibly can. The other 2 films of the trilogy have much more conventional and less experimental fictional storytelling, the second of which is the Rose McGowan starring the Doom Generation, or a heterosexual movie by Gregg Araki, which follows Jordan White and Amy Blue, a young couple picking up a random drifter, Xavier Red, who after engaging in a moment of violence, sets our young couple further down a descent that they're unable to pull away from. Or the third of these films, Nowhere, or the Gregg Araki movie, which it absolutely earns that title, was described by Araki as Beverly Hills 90210 on acid and follows a group of queer teenagers trying to simply live in their everyday outrageous lives in LA, involving unclear visions of the future, a reoccurring televangelist attempting to push these kids to lose their lives, and the potential of alien abduction. And also, all 3 of these films are led by the incredible James Duval, an actor who deserves so many more flowers and who really brings our films together. I also view these 3 films having a lot of shared DNA beyond existing as part of the same trilogy, with my latest rewatch of these films involving the new Criterion Collection set, which, oh my god, is such a step forward beyond the extremely poor digital copies of the film floating around online and the bootleg DVDs that I purchased off of eBay. Seriously, these films would not have the audience that they have today without piracy keeping them alive, while they suffer from not having much more modern restorations or streaming releases for years, but totally effed up while as experimental as it is with format and often using a still camcorder to provide a voyeuristic view. It's also the most straightforward film of the trilogy, providing a didactic form of storytelling that wants to inform its viewers of the pain of queer America, tell it how it is, and builds up the understanding of why the film's tragic ending seemingly comes out of nowhere. The Doom Generation really rests in the feeling of expanding on that idea and having us exist in the lived experience of queerness in America, which through the hopelessness and pain of Gregg Araki, translates into a film where America literally is hell, which we can see through the illusions of items costing $6.66, the lives of these young people being uprooted by gun violence and becoming these scapegoats for pain for literal neo-Nazis, and the last names of these characters are red, white, and blue. The film also takes place in mostly abandoned landscapes in order to give the film a closer feeling to it being the end of the world, and maybe the title alludes to this, but Nowhere focuses on what could be the culmination of all these thoughts on queer life and what exactly queer life is. And sadly for some, that's sadly taking their lives due to the failure of society to provide adequate support, or because the beliefs of religious fanatics all over the world who live such hateful lives using queer people as their personal punching bags, or for you to feel alien because these feelings and attraction that you have just feel so distant from everyone else's, or you can still find yourself unclear about the future in front of you. It also feels with this film that we have the furthest queering about a narrative or theming, with the film at times being the most chaotic of the trilogy, but one that feels overwhelming with emotion at every single instant. It's also the most imaginative of the films, using the most expansive use of color between all three films, and also bedrooms in this film are really magnificent, filled with these giant murals and quotes, and becoming an extension of the inner thoughts of these characters. Thinking about bedrooms in general, so many of them can feel like our fortress of solitude, our nest of safety whenever the world around us is crashing down, and the world of Gregg Araki's Nowhere, they're designed in a way to express everything that they can be for these young characters. And regardless of how these movies move you, or even if you do like them, it's impossible to deny how angst shapes these narratives and makes for an evocative experience shining light on queer characters who are allowed to be queer and horny, and being flawed in all the ways that everyone in the world should be allowed to live, because all humans should be allowed to be flawed. Following up a series of films with such a reputation feels like an impossible task for most directors, and while not necessarily reflective of reaching the end of the new queer cinema movement, which was due to there being weirdly more queer films, but far less willing to queer their formatting as they became mainstream, it leads Araki to make a film that feels like a riff of 90s romantic comedies in a very Araki way, but makes for a film that feels far safer than anything he made before at the time, and honestly feels like a far cry from his previous work for me, and that is Splendor. The 1999 film follows Veronica, a young blonde who finds herself pulled between two men, Abel, a young, compassionate poet, and Zed, a hunky, tattooed drummer, who feel like oil and water the second that they move and clash against one another in the film. And when Veronica finds herself thinking about which one of the two bachelors she'll find herself with, she decides, why not both? And funnily enough, not to comment too much on Gregg Araki's life, this was a film that was conceived due to the feedback and reaction of Gregg Araki, a publicly reported gay man who dated a woman, Kathleen Robertson, for 2 years between 1997 and 1999, who was also the lead for Splendor and also Claire from Beverly Hills 90210. And playing with the sandbox of the conventions of 90s rom-coms, Araki does queer the narrative a little here in a way that does feel meaningful. To take the will they or won't they plot that we expect from any romantic film and just say, screw it, let's have our blonde bombshell date them both, it just becomes even funnier considering the fact that they introduce a third love interest as a foil later in the film to go through all the emotions that we expect from a rom-com at this time. And not to say that Zed and Abel don't have agency, personality, or are trapped as one-dimensional pieces of meat here, but Gregg Araki is able to give Veronica a level of agency that we don't always see in our leads within the genre, making for a film that feels far more refreshing than I may be given credit for. And not to dismiss the film entirely, Gregg Araki has no films by any stretch of the imagination, but we want gay movies when watching his films. There is only the slightest of narrative queering here, and the film has the aesthetic, quirkiness, and camp that we expect from Gregg Araki, and it is very funny and it has very likable leads, but the film also has an extraneous use of voiceover from Robertson that it makes the film feel far too conventional when venturing into the realm of Gregg Araki, and doesn't do the director any favors by highlighting his strengths or why his films are so unique. Not to grade the director on a curve, but the film feels far too unremarkable for me to spend more time talking about it. Next we have maybe the most important film of Gregg Araki's career, easily the most well-known in the film community, and I think likely gained a profile because of its performance of Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Brady Corbet, our future director of the Academy Award winning The Brutalist, and a film that many child psychologists view as one of the most important and tasteful films about child abuse that's ever existed, Mysterious Skin. For those that might find themselves deeply uncomfortable by the subject matter and still want to hear more about Araki's work, similar to the man who made this film, I won't linger too heavily on the subject despite talking about the film, but that can still be triggering for people. Anyone who feels the need to skip ahead absolutely has the right to, and this video has chapters so that you can just skip along to the next film in Gregg Araki's catalog, Smiley Face, just by skipping to the next chapter in the video by fast forwarding. In the film, we follow two young teenagers who are teammates on the same Little League team as they both experience being sexually abused by their Little League coach. We then flash forward 7 years later, where we follow Neil's character, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who sadly views the abuse he experienced as love, holds onto these memories in a way that's even more uncomfortable for the audience, and now works as a sex worker at 15 years old, beginning to understand his queerness. And we have Brian, played by Brady Corbet, who has no memory of his past abuse other than remembering an incident involving a bloody nose in his parents' crawl space and now living his teenage life, believing that he was abducted by aliens at the time that he experienced child abuse. What is immediately striking to me is that although we experience half the film cloaked in mystery, or specifically Brian's attempts to uncover or understand the so-called alien abduction that he experienced as a child, there is nothing for us to uncover as an audience. It's clear as day the horrors this young boy has experienced, and the gravity of that is never lost, while also being told in an extremely tasteful way that never lingers on the violence that's taken place, but instead the reflection, coping, and rationalization of the terrors of the past. Even when filming the movie, there are great precautions in protecting the children who worked on the film in order to not traumatize them. Although their parents were given access to the entire shooting script of the film, the young boys in this film were given much more innocuous scripts to memorize, vaguely given details about their roles and what their connections to the other characters were, so that these young boys may have a scene where jelly beans are thrown at their face and they can enjoy filming that at the moment, and we can still take seriously what is happening in front of us without recreating that same abuse. And while I'm no means an expert, a number of psychologists have spoken out in support of the film, which is not always common in the depiction of trauma or mental health. Even for people who've never stepped foot in a therapy room before, it's really easy for us to understand that some depictions of mental health are stretched out or exaggerated in order to live up to the entertainment value of a film. But in the case of Mysterious Skin, we have two young boys who are navigating the world in a way that is sadly not uncommon for victims of horrendous abuse, and makes for easily one of the most upsetting films about the topic that I've ever seen. There were even sadly attempts to ban the film in Australia by conservative boards who likely knew who Araki was and tried to say that this film could be used as a manual for abusers to learn how to cause harm to others, but as Australian critic Margaret Pomeranz named when the film was allowed to release, people who indulge in crimes like that, if they saw this film, they would understand the damage that they do. And it's true, it's hard to imagine anyone seeing someone as coherent and present as Neil view any of this as positive or pleasurable. It's hard to witness him engaging in sex work and mostly engage working with older men as a 15-year-old, and to see him recoil at a man asking to be touched because he longed to be held and becomes uncomfortable at the intimacy is heartbreaking. And for Brian, we have a teen who's unable to cope or understand with what has happened, and it leads him down a path where he finds himself being unable to have a successful relationship because of similar challenges with physical touch as Neil, and knowing that he keeps having these recurring dreams with these aliens and recognizes Neil as a young boy who's been in his dreams and somehow on his little league team. And there is comfort and warmth in the ending with our two characters meeting and being able to find support with one another, and while the ending here is not happy for either of these two, as they're beginning to come to grips with their past abuse, at least they have each other. Mysterious Skin is a very unique film in Gregg Araki's catalog, but one that still meaningfully portrays queerness and how in the worst of times we can still find community and connection, and that feels so meaningful when thinking of Araki's work. After Mysterious Skin, Araki named wanting to intentionally pick lighter work moving forward and actually views his next film as a yin to his yang, with Mysterious Skin being Araki's first 100% serious drama, and his 2007 film Smiley Face, a stoner comedy where Anna Faris, a TV commercial actress, is high out of her mind in LA after being stoned and eating her roommate's entire plate of marijuana cupcakes, and stars alongside a young John Krasinski in Araki's first film that is 100% a comedy. It is also, funnily enough, Araki's first film that doesn't have queerness being key to his characters' lives, and honestly the only film, but never sacrifices existing through the same lens of humor that we saw during the Teenage Apocalypse trilogy. What follows is a series of hilarious hijinks that exist in a unique space that is the stoner comedy. See, when thinking about other films in the genre, some of my favorites are the Method Man and Redman starring How High, the film Pineapple Express, which I've seen well over 100 times and was so formative to my teenage years, or even Harold and Kumar, which was the Asian American representation that I needed as a kid, as someone who really needed to chill out. Those films are really great for what they are, making it so that we're clearly grounded watching these funny characters and funny situations and are present in the reality that our characters may not be. But in Smiley Face, we can find ourselves disoriented by the hazy and dreamy fog that is the film, as there can sometimes be random or nonsensical jumps in time or also blackouts taking place, and also the film moves at a snail's pace as we're alongside Anna Faris, who captures being a stoner so well, where I feel like whenever I think about stoner movies, Anna Faris might be the only performer that I've ever seen that doesn't feel like an actor pretending to be high, but instead feels like a person who might actually be high on set, and it all feels very disturbingly real watching the film. Harold and Kumar get high and ride a cheetah in order to get to White Castle or end up in Guantanamo Bay in their second film, and there's also Redman and Method Man smoking their friend's ashes, seeing his ghost, and using him to cheat on the SATs to get into Harvard. There is clear absurdist comedy wrapped up in all these scenarios, and I feel like that's most common when thinking about the stoner comedy. In a film like Smiley Face, we have Anna Faris forgetting to pay her electric bill or bombing an audition, and somehow ending up on a Ferris wheel of all places, questioning how she got there, and it all just feels so real and comes across as a nightmare scenario for many stoners, adding a level of realism that not only makes the film stand out in its subgenre, but also makes it much more relatable and effective as an experience, at least for me, and my god does it make it so much more funny. And for those that are fans of Anna Faris, maybe controversially, I think this is her best role. She's flexing comedic chops that prove that she's one of the best comedic actresses ever in film, and to have sharp writing and direction to match that is really wonderful. And the last two Gregg Araki films I have much less to say about, but that's because one, the first film is steeped in so much mystery, I think you can actually spoil the film if you talk much much about its theming, and two, the other film is a bit poor, it's a bit weak. It's a film that I actually didn't like on my first watch, but I've appreciated it much more on rewatch, and I do recommend these films both. I want to make that clear. You all know the Cannes Film Festival, right? You know, just the biggest film festival in the world, right? Well, in 2010, or the time that Gregg Araki was releasing his next film, Kaboom, or a film about Smith, an 18-year-old finding himself dreaming about mysterious women and cult worship, and who wants to sleep with his likely straight roommate Thor, the Queer Palm was unveiled, which was an award designed to highlight queer and transgender films at the festival that advanced the medium, and Araki would win that for Kaboom, or be the first person ever to win the Queer Palm, likely the biggest award that he's ever won during his entire career. And in the realm of film, this really feels like the last time that Araki ventured into the musings and stylizings that I expect when I think about his work during the height of the new queer cinema movement. I've called this film in the past a gay psychic movie, but really presents itself as an amalgamation of ideas that makes this film feel like the much younger brother of Nowhere, and I think is likely the film of his that I view as the most underappreciated. At times, the mystery feels singular, but intentionally so. We don't receive much clarity as an audience alongside our lead. The film is feeding us the smallest bits of information, so you don't lose that this is an older teenager trying to get laid, and navigating all the non-typical college drama that we expect from a queer teenager in a Gregg Araki film, and being intentionally vague about this movie because I want you all to experience it on your own. It's one that pulls back the curtain abruptly and ends seemingly in a random and shocking conclusion, but I think speaks so much to queerness and our relationships to parents, and feeling like they're responsible for the end of our world or the world itself, and I'll leave it at that. And finally, we have a film of Araki's that was the only that I disliked until a recent revisit, White Bird in a Blizzard, Araki's second adaptation after Mysterious Skin, and is likely the film that it shares the most similarities to. Following Kat Connors, played by Shailene Woodley, through several years of her life after the disappearance of her mother, and we sit in the non-linear tale of discovering what exactly happened to her. The film is sadly far less notable than Araki's work Between the Living End and Kaboom, having some noir elements with a mystery that feels a little bit too predictable here, and a cast that anchors on the brilliance of Eva Green and Christopher Maloney. And again, I do enjoy this film, but most of it comes across as dim and sterile, but it's not until the film comes to a shocking conclusion where many of Araki's central themes that we expect from his other films come crashing down and colliding and make the interpretation of the film far richer, but only for me on a rewatch. And maybe that's also on me. Maybe I shouldn't have so many standards for what a Gregg Araki film is, but I also can't shake off the disappointment for me here, considering how bold the director was earlier in his career and what his films meant to me and how it just kind of all ends here. At least for now. And again, not to belittle those last two films, I do really enjoy Kaboom. It's a great film. It's not even the worst film that Gregg Araki has ever made, but yeah, I just have a lot less to say here. Araki's films have meant so much to me with time, and rewatching them has also just made my appreciation of these films grow, and seriously, these new Criterion restorations feel like a revelation compared to anything that was available before. If you've only seen those previous restorations, please see these new copies. And while I've struggled in the past to feel hopeful about what's next for Gregg Araki, considering the fact that he's struggled to find funding for films for quite some time, and while he did have the Starz TV show Apocalypse Now in 2019, which I do need to watch, I will watch that sometime, he does in fact actually have a new film coming out this year in 2025 called I Want Your Sex, following Cooper Hoffman as Elliot, a man who receives a job for an artist named Erica, played by Olivia Cooke, who makes the young man her sexual muse and serves as, I believe, his dominatrix. And also we have Daveed Diggs, Johnny Knoxville, and Charlie XCX in the film. It sounds like a really exciting plot and cast, and knowing that Araki conceived the film because he believes that Gen Z has been too deprived of sex in the film, I don't know of another director that's more great to bring sex back to movies. I really do thank you all for tuning in. For anybody who hasn't seen his movies before, catch up on them before you see I Want Your Sex. You know, start with the Teenage Apocalypse trilogy and then go from there, see what feels right to you. And thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you all next time.